Welcome to the Dialogue by Wirepoints, connecting the dots between our economy, government, and people. And now your hosts, Ted Dabrowski and Mark Glennon.
Hello, everybody. This is Ted Dabrowski from Wirepoints, and thank you for joining the dialogue. Of course, I'm with my partner, Mark Glennon, and today we have as a guest Matt Rosenberg. And Matt is a person who's written a new book about Chicago and the things that ail Chicago. And it's a very timely book. And just as a quick intro, I happen to be lucky enough to do, I think, 2 interviews on Matt's father's show. Milt Rosenberg, a longtime WGN person. He was a icon on that radio show. And I got to be on there twice, and I loved it. And it was so fun to be on with him. Well, Matt is Milt's son, and they have a long history on Chicago. And Matt, of course, he's done many things. I've seen he's driven a yellow cab he's been an author, a journalist, done all kinds of things. I'll let Matt explain a little bit who he is because he'll do a better job of it than I will. But suffice it to say that Matt was a journalist in Seattle for the last 20 years or so, I think, if I have it right. And then he's come back to Chicago. He was watching what was happening here and didn't like what he saw, and he came back to write this book. So let's just get right into it. Matt, thanks for being on. Look, tell us a little bit about yourself so we have the perspective of who this person is writing this book, and why did you write this book?
Sure, Ted, and I'm pleased to join you and Mark today. I first cut my teeth on sort of civics and journalism in Chicago in the summer of 1977. Stumbled into the Mirage Tavern investigation as an intern with the Better Government Association. Got to work with some great Chicago journalism icons, guys like Bill Rechtenwald, a quiet giant, who later worked as an investigative reporter for the Tribune. Also, of course, Pam Zeckman and Zay Smith. And I was just a young grunt who made backwards screwdrivers, 3 parts vodka to 1 part orange juice. And but I learned a lot and kept my eyes open and got some exposure to the way things worked here. As the years went on, I worked as a suburban news reporter, got tangled up in regional airport issues here, which was a real education, and moved out to Seattle for similar work in 1994. So I spent 30 years here. And I've been coming back ever since I left. I can't stay away. But in the summer of 2020, I was just drawn back by all the chaotic violence and disorder, wondering what had gone wrong. And so I came back, I moved into Bridgeport, and I went deep into the South Side to talk to Black people and Latinos in their homes and workplaces. I wanted to hear their success stories, and I continue to believe that success stories from tough communities are super important. And I wanted to hear their diagnosis of what's gone wrong and how to fix it. And other things went into my book as well, but that was a huge piece of it.
Matt, great to have you. Mark Glennon here. And by the way, you are not to be confused with another journalist named Matt Rosenberg at the New York Times, who has somehow seen fit to keep his Pulitzer Prize for the Russia collusion story, which that's a different topic. And we've only recently started taking up crime and some other issues that have gained overriding importance here in Chicago. So it's only recently that I've seen your blog where you compile your pieces, and they're all very well written, very well researched, and I encourage everybody to go to your blog as well. Chicago Schooled is the name of it, where you collected some of those articles that cover some of the topics in your book.
Thank you, Mark.
So what did you find? What were people looking for? What were you looking for when you went to the South Side and to the other neighborhoods? And what did you hear they want? I know it was a period of discovery for you, I think.
It really was. I was riding the number 8 bus down Halsted from 35th, down to 79th, then walking all the way down to 87th into, for instance, the home of Ron and Latasha Fields in Washington Heights. So what I discovered let's take it first, say, from 20,000 feet. What I discovered was that conservative values are alive and thriving in minority communities in Chicago and, from what I can see, around the country. So when I say that, I mean a few specific things. Big takeaways. None of it rocket science, but really important to bear in mind for all of us, progressives especially. Number one, urban Black folks and Latinos generally want more police. They also want better police. There's great emphasis on the importance of intact two-parent families. Going along with that, I heard as well a real emphasis on raising your kids right, parenting, discipline, looking out for your kids as they're growing up. So those were a few of the things that I found. I also had a chance to look at the economic development side of things, Ted and Mark, and it was quite interesting. And there's some stories that I share in the book about Pullman, where they've had a tremendous resurgence, an important, almost landmark neighborhood economic redevelopment success story, something that's been documented in a great white paper by the Booth School at the University of Chicago. But on the other hand, right next door, Roseland, typical of a struggling neighborhood downtown in Chicago, but one neighborhood among several that are just begging for transformation. There's so much potential in Roseland. And I walked the streets of, Michigan Avenue between 103rd and 115th in Roseland. And it looks like Aleppo, Syria after a bombing raid. It's tragic. And this is a place with the bones of great architecture still remaining, a great history, including as a thriving neighborhood commerce district. So I got to dig in a little bit to what it would take to turn around economically struggling areas. I got to dive in a little bit with a great guy named David Doig, who's the head of the Chicago Neighborhoods Initiative and who ran, I think, the Park District under Mayor Daley II for a few years. A great, important Chicago guy, David Doig is, I think. I got a chance to learn more about how the Pullman success story unfolded, about repopulating vacant neighborhoods, ghost neighborhoods with more homes, what role the city could play. And I even learned about a very successful micro-lending program that the Chicago Neighborhoods Initiative, CNI, as it's known, has undertaken out of its Pullman headquarters, where ex-convicts are coming in to get loans of about $20,000 or $40,000 at a time to start delivery services, feeding off the Amazon economy. And that stuff's brilliant. I'd love to see more micro-lending programs for minorities around the city as part of a broader and more serious economic plan that's not just chalkboards and meetings and web pages, which is, Lightfoot's trying there, I guess. There's some hopeful signs, but we're so far from implementing.
Matt, tell me a little more about what made Pullman, let's say, a success. This is one of the main sources of departure between progressives and conservatives. They say, come on, we've been throwing trillions of dollars at these neighborhoods for 40 years. It hasn't worked. Devin Jones is a Southside activist, a Black conservative that we had on the show. He did feel that some of these spending programs are essential to making these neighborhoods work. What's your sense of that on those spending programs? What made Pullman work?
Pullman had exceptional qualities. First and foremost, a very large vacant brownfields parcel where a steel plant had formerly operated. So in a way, though it sounds strange, that was an advantage because it was a parcel of land several hundred acres large, but there were tax incentives that really helped. One type was called New Market Tax Credits, which basically is an incentive to private investors who invest in an urban redevelopment project in a blighted area, get a significant credit to their federal income tax. There were also TIF incentives used, and this was at least one instance where TIF actually fit. We know that TIF has been badly misused in political ways in Chicago, but it seemed to help here. So those were two pieces. That wasn't the whole enchilada. There was a lot of community consultation and real leadership, tough bargains struck. A new Walmart came in with a grocery store that people really wanted. There were concessions to labor. There were concessions to local employee interests. There were compacts drawn up, but then it just kept coming. Method production line, those green home cleaning products. The company's name is Method. The parent company is in Racine. There's an outfit called Gotham Greens growing huge amounts of organic greens for consumers to eat on the roof of the Method manufacturing facility in that same industrial park in Pullman. Then an Amazon distribution facility came in. And a huge community activity center with corporate sponsorship, plus other retail. So it was a great, great project.
Hey, Matt, I really kudos to you for covering the good things that happen. Bob Woodson from United, 1776 United, that's what his work revolves around, the good that a lot of people can do in their community. So that's awesome. Now, obviously, when you came back in 2020 and you were watching from Seattle, and there's a lot of bad things happening in Seattle as well, but when you came back, that's not, you found these good things going on, but there were a lot of problems, and you've covered a lot of those problems, a lot of things that you've described as pissing you off. So why don't you move to those things that are pissing you off in Chicago?
Absolutely. And just a parenthetical note, there's even more good stuff, but we've got serious problems. Absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the biggest things that's pissing me off, I'll name two. Our schools are utterly failing. Our public schools in Chicago, K through 12, that strikes particularly hard on Black and Latino families. There's some pathways out that we're aware of, a few, some partial implementation of school choice, but the performance data are just utterly, totally miserable in the aggregate. So that's grave. That's a very grave issue, and it's just been festering for decade after decade. So that's something everybody should be pissed off about, in my estimation. Another thing is the way that our political elites and media elites have kind of internalized this picture of police as sort of inherently racist and bad. They really don't know how to do the math. They don't really want to look at the total number of contacts between police and the public versus the number of instances where force is actually used, which is utterly, dramatically minuscule. I'm pissed off because politicians won't use their bully pulpit to make it clear that police are good, that they care, that they come from these communities, and that they want to go in there and really deter crime. I'm pissed off we haven't more robustly implemented foot patrols, which we actually did in 2013 and 14 under Gary McCarthy and Rahm Emanuel, and it had a quantitative easing effect on violent crime that was documented. And Chicago's just one of, 8 or 9 cities where studies have documented that same effect from robust targeted foot patrols in high crime areas. But I think more than that, I'm really concerned about the underlying narrative about the way we discuss race and responsibility in the urban centers of the United States. I'm extremely concerned about something you guys and others are well aware of, the whole social justice framework, the whole notion of persistent and pernicious systemic racism, and also the way it ties back to this obsession with junk math. I'm sure you're familiar with the term disparities, right? And disparate outcomes. Well, my take is that obviously man is imperfect. And so therefore we have different outcomes in all kinds of areas, from education to income to incarceration. And there's this theory that anytime that the differences are clear by race, that therefore institutional racism must be responsible. We need to strip it back to the individual, to the choices that people make or don't make. And we've got this accompanying rhetoric. You know, there was even an exhibit in one of the Smithsonian museums, the National Museum of African American History, where included in the content was the proclamation that a focus on the written word and things like punctuality, that these were inherently white concepts. So we're defining planning for the future as white, being able to write well as a white thing, being on time as a white thing. And this stuff is pernicious, and it's also very racist. And so this whole idea that Blacks can't be held to equally high standards is itself racist because it says they're not capable. Shelby Steele talked about this last winter in a Zoom forum based out of Chicago that I listened to and wrote about in my book. So that stuff really sticks in my craw.
Yeah, in fact, we've heard, again, Devin Jones, when we talked to him about this topic, said that Blacks in the city, we asked about CRT, Ted did, and he said, what's CRT, jokingly, that, you know, this is something that the white folks in the suburbs argue about, and a few loudmouth politicians and activists get a lot of press about, but minorities in the inner city are concerned about the basic things. They want their garbage cans replaced when they get stolen. They want their streets plowed and the basic nuts and bolts of government. Yeah, they want the police to treat them fairly, but they want more police protection. We've had that validated by a real clear poll that we took in Chicago. There was a good question I saw that was put to you by the City Journal. I'm going to ask the same question too. You also drew a connection between the corruption of politicians in Illinois and their penchant for deflecting accountability through this systemic racism. Can you explain a little bit what you meant there? What is that connection?
Can you explain what you think I wrote a little more clearly?
That they use the systemic racism as a means to shield themselves, apparently, from the charge of their incompetence, that it's a made up excuse sort of, and that it's just a reflection of the corruption at the level of politics and elected officers in Illinois and Chicago.
Yes. Well, I think there's a common thread, you know, if to some extent, if you don't get nailed, it's all good. And that's certainly how Chicago politicians have looked at their own corrupt endeavors. But what you were talking about and what I was talking about in that interview with City Journal is yes, it's a shucking off of responsibility, because there's a strident leftism, number one, in Chicago City Hall and in other cities around the country that denies Black agency. Then, particularly in Chicago, there's an incompetence, right, to take care of actual business, running the schools right, deploying police intelligently, like say on foot patrols, instead of just having them drive from one 911 call to another. Then there's an ambition. After the strident leftism, after the incompetence, there's an ambition which fuels a desire to hold power for its own sake rather than to wield it for the public good. And then there's this endemic corruption, which entails a whole set of rigged rules of governance down to the timing of our elections, which is a stealth form of voter suppression, voter turnout being dampened to 1/3. So I think by bringing up systemic racism, as Lori Lightfoot, for example, so often does, our mayor in Chicago, it's a way of deflecting accountability from the wreckage, which results from the leftism, the incompetence, the ambition, and the corruption. And Lori Lightfoot in particular is kind of a tragicomic story. She talked such a good game. She seemed so clearly to have the right stuff. She had an intelligent and worthy focus on Chicago's corruption as a candidate. And she communicated that so clearly and compellingly. Everyone lined up and said, this is the one. And as soon as she got in, she faced some big challenges that weren't expected, including COVID and including the violent aftermath of George Floyd's death. But, I think leadership has to adapt and respond to unexpected events. You see what you're really made of when weird stuff comes at you from a weird angle. And that's not what happened here. And so since then, she is hidden behind excuses. Everything is always explained by her administration now. Everything from ghost neighborhoods to the higher murder rate among Blacks to a whole bunch of other things is explained in terms of either, it's systemic racism's fault, it's guns, it's always something else. So yes, there's this huge, egregious tendency to sidestep accountability here. And it leaves me wondering, how do we take back the government in Chicago? And that's really why I feel like I want to stick around here and track that. I don't know if it's possible.
Hey, Matt, you've touched on Lightfoot there and accountability, responsibility, management. Talk a little bit about what you found when you look at Lightfoot, the trifecta of Lightfoot, Kim Foxx, state's attorney from Cook County, and also the Cook County Chief Judge, Tim Evans, because, we've got, it's important we talk about root causes, and, in the end, to fix all these problems, you've got to fix the root causes. And you've touched on several of those, family, et cetera. But at the same time, we gotta stamp out the problem right now. We gotta put, a finger in the dike of all the murders going on, the carjackings and all that. So talk a little bit about the mistakes those three guys were making, three guys and gals.
Tim Evans is central to the continuing grave violence which afflicts Chicago. When he decreed essentially bail reform into existence in 2017, he set into motion something really foreboding. Just too many guys have been let out on low cash or no cash bail, even though they were initially charged on violent crimes or gun crimes, which I know our state's attorney Kim Foxx sees gun violations, ones which don't involve shooting, as merely technical and nonviolent. And so guys are let out for having guns when they can't legally possess them or because they don't have the right paperwork. But then that guy that gets out on low cash or no cash bail on a technical gun charge too often goes and uses that gun in a carjacking, a shooting, or even a murder. So that's a big problem. But Evans bears a lot of responsibility for setting the tone and for condoning and codifying a misapplication of what bail reform was supposed to be about. If it were confined, as originally defined, to nonviolent offenders and primarily first-time nonviolent offenders, I would not have a problem with it, nor would a lot of other people. The problem is somehow the judges in Cook County believe it's their mission and duty, with very few exceptions, to let all kinds of people out on low cash or no cash bail, even if they've just committed a carjacking. Then too, moving to Kim Foxx, there's a lot of data there. There was that detailed analysis by the Tribune that her office had prosecuted something like 6,500 fewer crimes, or had dropped 6,500 more crimes in their first 3 years than in her predecessor's last 3 years. That's important. But there are also lousy plea deals. Guys out on probation for raping a woman on a CTA train, who then go and do the same thing, except now it's in an alley in Lakeview instead of on the train. I talk about that one in my book. The 73-year-old Black grandfather and veteran killed in Hyde Park this summer, Keith Cooper, in a parking lot, in a carjacking gone wrong. Charged for that was a young man who was on probation for juvenile carjacking. The graduate student from China who had just completed his master's in statistics at the University of Chicago, Denny Zheng, killed only weeks ago. The alleged killer, someone who was on parole in this case for a convictions, plural, on a juvenile armed robbery and carjacking. So our court system's overall lenience is huge. And then I think, too, the judicial elections, and that comes back a little bit to we the people and we the media. I think everybody needs to be taking a closer look at who we elect to these spots as Cook County Circuit Court judge. And granted, it's like eye glazing and there's too many of them. There's too much on the ballot, but how would we begin to construct a system where there are detailed questions which ferret out how judicial candidates really feel about some of these important criminal justice issues? I can't prescribe the mechanics of it sitting here now, but I think something needs to be designed, and somebody's got to take the lead on this so we can make our judicial races competitive and then hold judges accountable. What about a data project that was easily accessible online and tracked the actions of judges? As it is now, we tend to go to one fantastic website, CWB Chicago, and we get this stuff on a piecemeal basis. That's a whole lot better than nothing. But I think there needs to be some systematic way that everybody can access this information.
Yeah, and by the way, how do you replace the chief judge of Cook County? Forgive my ignorance. Is that directly elected or chosen by the other judges, or what?
My understanding is that the chief judge is actually selected by the elected judges who are seemingly beneath him in rank. In other words, we elect in our various judicial districts in Cook County all these different circuit court judges. They in turn select the chief judge. That's my understanding.
Which of Chicago's problems are unique to Chicago, or at least more critical in Chicago than other cities? Because you looked at a lot of other cities have some of these same problems, very high crime, and certainly LA right now, but many other places. What's distinctive about Chicago in your view?
I still want to say violence because of the degree of it here and because of the degree of dysfunction in the underlying systems we've been discussing. However, I would also add to that list, even more clearly distinct is our corruption and our rigged rules of governance. Even there, we're not completely alone when it comes to certain rigged rules, like having important municipal elections scheduled in odd-numbered years in the early months of the year in order to depress greater voter turnout, a setup which greatly encourages, the incumbent elites being reelected and continuing with their same rotten policies. It is something that plays to the strength of public employee unions who will show up to vote in a hailstorm in February, whereas others won't, because they need to have their bread buttered. And yeah, I'm talking about pensions and the pension reform that never happens, among other things. But I think overall, the corruption and the rigged rules of governance are fairly elaborate here in Chicago, more so than in most other places. And as with everything, it's the culture beneath. The political culture here has evolved to such a state. It's just such a game. It's a sport, Yeah, we have the Shachtman decree, and you can't do overt patronage hiring to the degree you could in the past. But the ways that the players game the system, is just remarkable. And one only has to look at the 4 federal indictments of those individuals orbiting former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan to get a feel. It's that old wink and a nod culture. So we seem to have perfected that to a high, or I should say low, art here in Illinois and Chicago. We stand out.
Matt, you seem to have some views on the political endgame for Chicago. You've talked about what's happened in New York and the elections there. Talk a little bit about that political endgame for Chicago. Where are we going from here? And maybe a question that you can wrap in there is, people looking at Chicago and the mess that we're in, and of course, lots of big cities are in a mess now. But why do people keep voting for the same if it's so bad?
Yeah, that first one, Ted, I continue to rack my brain about that. I don't know. My dad was a social psychologist, and he did some work at one point on something called cognitive dissonance. And I think that maybe voters here suffer from that. We know what's wrong. We know what would be the right ways to fix it. And yet, we keep basically banging our head against the wall the same old way. I think it's partly because, on the whole, these days, voters in Cook County cannot bring themselves en masse to put a Republican in office, number one. So that's part of the reason. It's a one-party system, and it's not entirely the fault of voters. Yes, there was a Republican opponent to Kim Foxx. Yes, I'm sure he would have been a better choice than Kim Foxx, but that's not what voters decided. So I think moving to the envisioned endgame, and believe me, it's just a hazy pipe dream at this point, but we need something like a new Reform Party, the Chicago Reform Party, to form a slate. And I know that our local elections are technically nonpartisan, although that hasn't stopped 6 members of the Democratic Socialists of America from ascending to the city council. And we know that almost all the other members, with a few exceptions, are, declared Democrats. So I think we need a new Reform Party or something like that with an actual slate and a platform. We need money people to settle on the right mayoral candidate. I have no idea who that might be. And we need a whole new slate of aldermen. And somehow we have to fund civic engagement work, voter registration, and get out the vote work in our city's minority neighborhoods. I think that's huge. And I point in part to New York City, where in the Democratic primary last fall, a very moderate pro-school choice, pro-law enforcement Democrat, Eric Adams, as you know, defeated several other Democrats who lean much more in the direction of New York's outgoing Mayor Bill de Blasio. And so if Eric Adams can get elected in New York City, why could there not also be a Chicago equivalent of that? So we need candidates of color who respond to the actual sentiments in the community that I saw myself when I went deep into the South Side for my book. Candidates who can speak to law and order, public safety, thriving neighborhood business districts, and the importance of family and schools that work and a court system that works. Where are those people? What would motivate them to run for office? That I can't say. So there's got to be some intensive R&D work on that end.
For our listeners too, the name of Matt's book is What's Next Chicago, Notes of a Pissed Off Native Son. Just as he's talking here, it's full of concrete suggestions. I really commend you for your command of the facts and the concrete solutions you offer. A lot of us do a lot of hand wringing about these problems, but you don't hear too many specific suggestions on them. Matt, let's turn to the Hispanic minority a little bit, where you've focused on that as well. I think many of us tend to focus on the African American community. That is, in fact, where the crime problem is centered. But how is the Hispanic community different? Obviously, inroads have been made elsewhere in the country with Hispanic voters somewhat, to some degree, turning away from the progressivism that has been corrupted, I think, across America. Well, what's your take on that? How do the Hispanic voters differ? How do the challenges in the tougher Hispanic neighborhoods differ from the Black neighborhoods?
Well, for one thing, I think the Latino voters in Chicago and even the Latino politicians, on the whole, they're not yet demanding power the way that the Blacks have. Certainly some of our Latino elected officials are, and we've got a very high profile dispute now between Latino and Black aldermen on the city council over redistricting, who gains a district, who loses a district. I have my own take on that whole idea of, having such a thing as a Latino district or a Black district. And this whole idea that, Latino people are best represented by a Latino alderman, and likewise for Blacks. I think that's very oversimplified, and it hasn't really proven out into better policy for those neighborhoods. So I think that's kind of an antiquated, spoils-based notion of district remapping. But, let's not go any further down that rabbit hole. I do think, and as other wise men and women have told me, the Latinos are not yet demanding power to the extent that Blacks in Chicago are. I hope they get there soon, because frankly, having a rudimentary understanding of the conservative values that are prevalent in a lot of the Latino community, that could have a net positive effect. And, looking at the population data by race in Chicago only over the last 4 decades, it's true that the Latino influx is slowing, and that could have potentially dire consequences for the city's continued growth. There was marginal growth, as you guys know and have written about, just in the last decade. Marginal population growth in Chicago, 1 or 2%, fueled largely by the Latino and Asian influx. But if conditions don't get better, and I point us all toward the recent killing of the 71-year-old grandfather in Chinatown, prominent story in the news, just heartbreaking story, guy going out to get a newspaper, community in an uproar. If that stuff doesn't change, the Asian population influx could start to trickle away too. But I think what's really different among Latinos is they're quiet and they just go get to work. I was staying in Bridgeport while I was going down deep into the South Side. I would go take walks. One day I found myself all of a sudden, this was like November 2020, in the throes of the pandemic, I found myself at the corner of somewhere like 37th and Kedzie, kind of the ass end of nowhere, up against a freight yard. I look around thinking, where in the world am I? And then I notice it's yet another Latino business district. And in the middle of COVID, there are shops full of people waiting in lines, financial services, taquerias, bakeries, travel agencies, all kinds of stuff, all seemingly Latino-owned businesses. I walked up and down Western Avenue from about 37th, down to 47th and back. More and more and more Latino businesses. I was down in Woodlawn at Project Hood with Reverend Corey Brooks. I found him in an empty lot at a Halloween harvest party where I volunteered and was passing out hot dogs. He was talking in the back to an angry young man. I asked him later, "What's the beef about?" And Reverend Brooks told me, "Well, he's in our construction industry training program." This was a young Black man. And he's a little bit honked off. He's got a Latino boss at his work site Monday through Friday who's giving him a hard time, saying, "You got to fill out your time cards every day and you got to be on time." And Reverend Brooks said that he counseled this young man, "Listen, these are the soft skills of the workplace. You got to be on top of this stuff. And don't tell me you're having a hard time with a Latino boss. They're all over the construction industry and they're here to play." And that was my big takeaway. The Latino population is quiet, hardworking. They tremendously value family and faith, and they are here to play. So they're a sleeping giant. And I think that as they step up and claim a greater share of political power, which to me is so much more than seats on the city council, it's leadership in our civic life. And as they claim more of that power in Chicago, potentially that could have a transformative effect. And I hope Asians will too. They also have a culture where actions, not words, and a humbleness is kind of baked into their daily life. And that's commendable, but Chicago's not that kind of place, right? The guy who grabs for it with gusto is the guy who controls the game. So I want to see Latinos and Asians step in.
Yeah, and it's true in Chicago and elsewhere. Hispanics are very entrepreneurial. It sure doesn't seem to me that their values are reflected in their leadership. Somehow, the hardcores like the Chuy Garcias get elected here and elsewhere. That's changing to some extent, but we really need to have Hispanic candidates step up that really reflect the values of their community. And you're right. You don't see Hispanics among the homeless. Interestingly, I mean, you see this just in the videos you see on television from across the country. But this summer I walked through the tent cities in Austin, Texas, where they've sprung up, and it's white guys, white males fill these tent cities everywhere. It's not blacks, and it's certainly not Hispanics. It's very interesting.
Matt, quick question that I haven't heard you touch on, and that bothers Mark and me a lot, is the political elite. This is Chicago is also a place with massive companies, massive amounts of money. The corporations and their leaders have a lot of influence. Where are they? My guess, and I don't know, in New York, do they play a much bigger role? Do they keep that place in better shape and better organization? But in Chicago, for me, it's just, they're missing in action in many ways, or they're part of the problem, one or the other.
I think in most of our big cities, business and big business are increasingly part of the problem because they've stepped away from real civic involvement and responsibility. I know that with respect to Chicago, for instance, I was having lunch recently down at the Greek Islands with, I'll just call him a prominent behind the scenes Blue Dog Democrat, not an office holder, but someone very plugged in. And he said he was bemoaning the disengagement of business in civic affairs. They've got no clout, they're fractured, they're scared, they're walking on eggshells, like a lot of the rest of us. And let's just look, for example, at that tragic comic opera involving the CEO of McDonald's, when it came out that he had dared to say in what he thought were private texts to Mayor Lightfoot, later recovered, I guess, through a Freedom of Information request, that parents are responsible for what their kids do. And he said that with specific reference to the Adam Toledo shooting and to one other case where a young girl lost her life in a shooting at a McDonald's drive-through, one of his franchisees. When he said that parents are responsible, he got crucified as racist. There were people protesting outside, I think, the HQ in Oak Brook. I forget, but people were protesting. He should step down. Well, flash forward about a month later, at a presser the other day, Lightfoot is being grilled about the weekend violence downtown. What does she say? Parents, damn it. And yeah, thanks, Lori. And then she said, we've got to hold these young men and women accountable. And of course, that's where it all falls apart. See Kim Fox, see Tim Evans. But, no one called her racist. So the thing is, though, CEOs are afraid of being the next McDonald's CEO, right? They're scared to speak their mind, whether it's something as elemental as calling for parental engagement or something a little more nuanced, getting really engaged on what's gone wrong, stepping up on growing school choice, stepping up on the inevitable push we really need for real school choice, for full-on raging vouchers, and the federal court challenge that would surely come from the teachers union. Why not force that hand to be played? Why wouldn't business, who needs an educated, agile workforce, why would they not have a compelling interest in that? They're intimidated into silence. Imagine what CTU would do to any CEO that dared to really step up for school choice greater and more substantial than what we are allowed to have now in Illinois.
Well, I see some rays of hope on that front. You use that phrase, walking on eggshells. We hear that constantly from many people, especially in academia. But people are starting to speak up. Ted and I debated. We attacked the Black Lives Matter organization, back in 2020 when no one would dare say that. But we went ahead and did it. Of course, we got called fascist and racist and all the rest. But I don't hear that kind of charge coming as much. It's getting a little bit old. Have you been subject to those kinds of charges? You call things like you see them. And I would hope that people are beginning to see that voices like yours have to be heard, and that brave people that are speaking up are the ones that have something to be said. Where do you think we're going on that?
I think there's a definite progress being made, personally and professionally, just as a commentator who, as you say, calls it like he sees it, and who believes it's important to call out, what real racism is versus manufactured racism. Yeah, I've had some darts thrown at me even recently, and I'm posting more on my personal Facebook page, stepping up, not avoiding politics there. And, I've always had a lot of progressive friends and still do. And some of them are like, oh my God, I thought you were a decent person, but you just said this. And I'm like, yeah, well, I'm that same guy. And actually, I go way back on this stuff, to the time when I was a Seattle Times op-ed writer, just about the only conservative in the corral back then, not a social conservative, but certainly a fiscal conservative and someone who's willing to call out, toxic misdirection regarding how we talk about race and responsibility. But I see some encouraging signs. There's a revolt of the cities that I see starting to unfold as of our last election day, last month. It's not just Eric Adams moving forward in New York. Columbia, South Carolina elected a Republican mayor despite high-profile endorsements for his Democratic opponent. This in a county where I understand Biden took the majority in double digits. In 2020, Minneapolis rejected that ballot measure to eviscerate their police department. Seattle elected a Republican city attorney over an end the police leftist. Seattle also elected centrist, putatively pro-business officials as mayor and for one council seat in each instance against stridently leftist candidates. San Francisco is going to have a school board recall election this February. Very interesting. It was occasioned by two or three things. There are 3 school board members who will face recall February 15. They, number one, sought to weaken competitive admissions to Lowell High School, the city's largest, really only elite high school for high achievers. We know the school well. Some of our best friends live in the Mission District, and their 3 daughters all went to Lowell. The problem was there were too many Asians winning acceptance there. The inconvenient white adjacent minority, Asians. Those school board members also announced during the height of COVID, while students were being locked out of classes, that they would undertake an effort to reevaluate the names of 44 public schools because, one of them might be named after Thomas Jefferson or something. That didn't go down too well. And then one of those board members also was found to have made anti-Asian slurs on Twitter. So no wonder. So there are other instances still, other things going on in other cities. Buffalo, the centrist Democrat incumbent who was mayor was bested in the primary by a socialist challenger, but won in the general election by mounting a write-in campaign. So there is, and of course there was Virginia, which is huge. So in school districts, of course, you could, write a fresh new book about, the revolt going on in suburbs around school districts and what they're emphasizing, what their values are versus what they should be. And if people want to try and reduce that to a few parents in Virginia who, as part of the greater uproar, objected to content on sexual orientation and sexual acts and a certain book, and I know that's out there. If people want to engage in belittling reductionism and say, oh, it's just a bunch of hardcore conservative parents who don't like explicit sexual materials in the library, and we're not about censorship, it's the new McCarthyism. If people want to engage in that kind of belittling reductionism regarding parent concerns about our school districts, I say go for it, because people are going to come back at you with links and screenshots of documents showing that critical race theory by another name, as Frank McCormick, a teacher from Waukegan who had an op-ed in the Tribune recently described it. It's out there. They're trying to instill among teachers and students the idea that disparities equal systemic racism, that we're still a blatantly racist country, and other such points along the same lines. This is what's coming in to our K-12 public schools now in places you would hardly imagine. It's happening in Evanston, and it's egregious and it's wrong. And the blowback to that is large, is growing. It's part of why things turned out the way they did in the Virginia statewide contests. So I see definite signs of encouragement, Mark. People are reaching their limit. I'll close this part by saying there was a yard sign I really liked in Seattle. I think it was for the Republican city attorney candidate who won. It was 2 words long. It said, "Had enough?"
Matt, that's a great ending. Look, it was about over probably near a year and a half ago that Matt, you called from, and we talked about your upcoming book, and we're so happy you're back to Chicago to covering such an important thing. Your book, What Next Chicago? Notes of a Pissed Off Native Son. Matt Rosenberg, thanks for being here. Thanks for engaging, and thanks for telling the truth about what's going on.
Thanks for having me, Ted, and your listeners can get the book online only at Amazon or Barnes & Noble.
Get it, listeners, read it, and most importantly, act on it. Thanks so much, Matt, for joining us.
Thank you, gentlemen.